One of
I'll probably embarrass you. I'm going to go on for a little while. not everything that you've done, but before taking her role as CEO, she served in the Obama administration as the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the Export-Import Bank, where we discussed today. She was working with my former dean at the New School.
Yeah, right.
In that position, she led a significant expansion of the bank's operations. And one of the things, the word that you'll hear often with every place that she's been is expansion. There isn't a place where she has been that hasn't expanded significantly under her leadership. So, as well as modernization, but she also modernized the Import-Export Bank as well. From 2001 to 2009, she served as the Chief Financial and Investment Officer for the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations, known as Gavi. And a number of you had questions about the intersection between health and education, so probably something she's been thinking about for a long time. She also headed up Gavi's Washington, D.C. office and worked closely with their partners to develop and implement a strategy that transformed Gavi again from a startup to one of the most successful and respected public-private partnerships working in international development. She led an innovative finance reform that could enhance delivery and financing of vaccines and a number of other things. She previously worked as a banker with a focus on emerging markets and held a variety of positions at the Carlyle Group, J.P. Morgan, Bankers Trust, and Citicorp. She serves currently on the expert panel on financing education of the Education Commission. You had one of those readings for today from the Education Commission. 2 working groups to explore financing and refugee education issues. I know a lot of you are interested in refugee issues. She serves on the Board of Regents of Mercersburg Academy and the Board of Directors of UNESCO's Institute of Statistics. She's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and she graduated with a BA with honors in history from Williams College, holds an MA in International Affairs from the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, and is a chartered financial analyst, and is probably responsible for the one and only time you'll see me in a tie. Without further ado.
Thank you. My goodness. Thank you so much. Well, my goodness, I don't know where to begin. I arrived here on 30th Street Station a few hours ago, was warmly greeted, and I've just had a wonderful visit here at UPenn for the last couple of hours, and I've been just incredibly impressed by everybody I've met so far. So thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. We have at least one UPenn graduate that I know of working at GPE. He runs all of our HR work. He's unbelievably an important part of our management team, and I told him, I'm going to your alma mater tomorrow. I'll try to make you proud. And it's also fun to be back in Philadelphia. I was here a couple of weeks ago. I sometimes think that Philadelphia gets a slightly overlooked as you sort of zoom from Washington to New York. But it's a fantastic city. I was here for a board meeting of Mercersburg Academy, and I went to the new museum on the American Revolution, which if you haven't gone to yet, you should. So it's great to be back here, and I feel a great sense of attachment to all academic institutions in Pennsylvania because my 2 boys went to Mercersburg Academy, my younger boys at Lehigh, just up the way, so it's great to be here. Well, let me start by saying that everything you need to know about international education is in this book. And so if you haven't read it, you should. And I was reading it again last night on my couch, just again familiarizing myself with it is really, really good. And I won't repeat what's in it, and I thought what I would do is build on it and give you, just again, situate the issue. I want to ask you some provocative questions to start with, and then I'll tell you a little bit of information about GPE, although I trust all of you are good at reading websites, so I'm not going to go read the website. I want to give you a sense of some of the immediate challenges we have ahead of us, and then I'm happy to answer whatever questions you have on your mind. So as you all sit here in the hallowed halls of an Ivy League university, it occurs to me that there may be, although I know many of you come from different countries, which is fantastic, but there may be kind of an automaticness to the fact that you're here. You probably have never ever questioned, should I go to school? Your parents probably have never questioned, should you go to school? You've probably had options ahead of you, and lots of options at all different levels of school. While throughout the world, you know, the question of who pays for education is a big question, and I would by no means look to sort of undervalue that question. You've probably had a sense of avenues about who gets to pay for coming to UPenn. And you know that there are financial aid programs and, yes, student loan programs which have their own problems, but there are ways for how it gets paid for. You've probably not questioned at the levels of school that you've been at that there are buildings with roofs and windows, that there are enough teachers, that there are books. In fact, in a university like this, and maybe some of the schools you've been to, often schools get criticized for being sort of in what we call an arms race, for building too many buildings. You probably have not even thought that there's a chance, if you're a girl, a young woman, that you might have gotten married when you're 10 or 12 instead of being sent to school. If you're a young man, a gentleman, it probably hasn't occurred to you that you might have gotten sent to go fight in a war instead of finishing school. So there's a certain automaticness that I think surrounds places like UPenn. So what I'm going to ask you to do now is close your eyes and use your imagination, and imagine that you're about age 5 or 6 or 7. You are sitting under a tree. There are 100 of others next to you. All of you are hungry to some extent. There's one teacher under the tree trying to teach you how to read. There might be 1 or 2 textbooks to look at. It may not be in a language that you understand or in a language that you hear in your house. You probably have had to walk a number of kilometers to get to school. If you are somehow thinking that you can't see or you can't hear, you have no idea how to get that problem dealt with. In the school that you're in, keep imagining, there's probably not really a bathroom that you can find. If you're a little bit older and a girl, there is not a bathroom that is separate from the boys' bathrooms, so when you get your period, pretty hard to deal with it. If you are 10 or 12 or of a girl, you might have been married already and you might not even be under the tree. So it is that set of circumstances that organizations like GPE try to help remedy. And you can see from those types of circumstances that it's very hard to learn anything. And that's why my organization exists. And I'm delighted that you all are studying international education so that you all can become leaders in the future to help in the effort to remedy these problems. So before I get to the slides about GPE itself, one of the mental images that I like to talk about when I talk about the work of GPE, and we were just talking with Dan Wagner about it, and a few others who are here, is this notion of a staircase or a notion of a pyramid. And the role that education plays, education systems play in a country is a vital role. And the way that I like to describe it, because sometimes it's hard to explain to people, because of this sense of automaticness and the sense that sometimes education can be taken for granted, is that education is a staircase that enables every kid, if it's done right, to start at the bottom of the staircase and learn what they can and what they need to at every step going up the staircase. So when they get to the top, they have the skills, soft skills, hard skills, inclination to be successful, productive, and thriving members of their society. And most of the countries that GPE works in, the 67 lowest income countries of the world, have some form of challenge with the staircase. The staircase is brittle, it's narrow, it's too steep. There's not enough money to get people to start on the bottom of the staircase and be able to progress up the staircase. There are not enough teachers. But yet, each country needs a staircase, a strong staircase, if it's going to thrive in the world. Another way to think about it is a pyramid. If you think about education systems, sometimes you can think about them like a pyramid. And what you like is for everyone to be able to start education in pre-primary school or nursery school, as it's called sometimes here. You know, go to elementary school, go to middle school, go to high school, go to college, and wind up at the top. But often what you see in countries is that the pyramid is very sharply shaped like this. And we talked with Professor Wagner earlier, Dr. Wagner, about, well, sometimes it's like this, but it's very big at the bottom, where there's some kids who have the wherewithal to get to a university, but they're not even able to get to what we would call middle school here. So it is this absence of access to education and quality education that is a huge challenge globally, and it's what my organization is all about. I often ask myself the question, and I want to just touch on a couple of additional questions. Why is it that education sometimes feels a little bit like the poor cousin, sort of on the development landscape? And I think it is because it is taken for granted sometimes. People think, well, it's just going to happen. It's the responsibility of somebody, and it's just going to happen. It's not really studied as much as health is, for example. That is beginning to change, and people have begun to realize, for example, if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, I like to say to people, there's 17 of them, but the only way to make progress on every one of them except SDG 4, which is the one on education, is you have to know how to read, write, and do math. So we better get SDG 4 right. So increasingly, the international community is coming to realize that absence of good quality education is going to be a barrier to achieving international development goals across the board. Whether or not it is climate change, or better health outcomes, or stronger democracies, or better economies, you name it. Without education, the rest of the SDG agenda is not going to advance. And one of the things that's happened, how many of you have been studying what the MDGs were versus what the SDGs are? Raise your hand if that's kind of common knowledge to you. Okay. For those who aren't quite so sure, one of the big shifts that has happened in education and in the international sort of development agenda around education is the shift from, in the MDGs, a very quantity-based approach to education. The goal was how many children were in primary school. That was the goal. To what the SDGs are about, SDG 4, which is, it really has added two new major points, which is it adds quality, are children actually learning something, and it adds the concept of equity, which is everybody getting a chance to get on the bottom of the staircase. Another question that I often like to think about, and this is what I talk to a lot of our donor partners about, is, so why does this all matter for the international environment now? I mean, certainly the development community knows that it matters, but if you are a foreign minister, or if you are a head of state, or if you're a parent, why does the fact that education standards aren't what they should be, why do people care about that? Why should they care about that? And I think that it's increasingly obvious that without better education standards, there are going to be a whole raft of ills that aren't going to get solved. So you all are on top of, I'm sure, all kinds of data, but one of the things that we often think about is that population growth in many of the countries that we work in is growing and growing at an accelerating rate. So the number of youth on the globe as a percentage of the total population is going up. And if you have a growing number of, let's say, 12 to 15-year-olds or 15 to 20-year-olds who don't have any of the basic skills They will not be able to be meaningful parts of society. But even more troubling, and troubling for them, they will not have a sense of hope about their future. People will then turn to other things, terrorism, war, extremism, to find a sense of belonging. And you can quickly see yourself in an environment globally where there's more and more and more dislocation. So better education matters to give people a sense of hope, to have a prayer of settling down a number of the security challenges that the globe faces right now. There are clear correlations between better education outcomes and better health outcomes. I was just, before I get to the rest of my list, I like to sprinkle stories in about where I've just been. I was in Sierra Leone last week, and it's very clear to me there that there is a close correlation between that government's ability or challenge in contending with the Ebola crisis and their education standards. And the government knows it, and they are now beginning to think about strengthening their education system as a result of what they witnessed and lived through with Ebola. Education has obvious benefits for democracy and citizens' ability to participate in their own governance, vote, hold their governments accountable. Another clear linkage is education and climate change. It's not just having the wherewithal and the skill set to deal with what climate change will bring. Also, and this is not super popular to talk about in some settings, but the later that people can delay having families and begin to bring down some of the population growth, it will reduce the carbon footprint. So better education standards, keeping children in school longer, will have knock-on positive effects for the trajectory that we're on as far as climate change is concerned. So a long way of saying that the issue that we are talking about, that we're all compassionate about, that you all are studying, is not a niche issue. It is not just a little issue over here. It is a vital issue for our future. And I have been remarkably impressed so far with all the folks that I've met in how they're sinking their teeth into it. And I encourage you to stick with it for your career, because it is absolutely vital that we get this one right. So let me stop there with the sort of the opening and tell you now a little bit about GPE and how we do what we do and why we have set ourselves up the way that we have. So the way, broadly speaking, the way that we think about education is through the lens of what we call education systems. So that's a sort of wonky word, and you're like, all right, well, what does that mean? What does an education system mean? Is it like a computer? You know, what is it, like electricity? Like, what is it? It's all the pieces that have to come together to enable a government to deliver education, which is a public service, to deliver it well. So, what's on that list? It is a big list. It is having enough trained teachers in the right places of the country where the kids are to make sure that pupil-teacher ratios are manageable. In many of the countries that I visit, pupil-teacher ratios, and it's really pupil-to-trained teacher ratios, are one trained teacher to sometimes 100 kids. In Malawi, it's like 120. I've seen it. Under the tree that you are imagining, there are probably 100 kids under that tree. It's having enough money to be able to enable the government to make school free. That is an enormous challenge, and not just free at the primary level, free all the way up through university. That is a systemic challenge, and it's about whether or not a government has the financial wherewithal to be able to do that. Another systemic challenge is about infrastructure. Even though the MDGs were about how much school is there, even though we've moved to the quality agenda, the question still about are there enough school buildings in all the right places is still a very meaningful question, particularly because what you often see is that a country will have a fair amount of primary school buildings, but not enough as you go to middle school and high school, and children have to walk much farther once they're going to what is called middle school and high school, and then they often drop out. So having enough infrastructure in the right places is part of having an adequate system. Another part of having an adequate system is oversight, inspectors, monitorers, people who look after the data. Education is a very administratively heavy thing. So these are some of the items that come together to constitute what we call a strong education system. And there's lots of other things on the list. I mean, it's a long list. Another thing that you look at is how many children are getting excluded, and what is the sort of socioeconomic makeup of those children? Is it mostly a particular ethnic minority? Is it girls? Is it children with disabilities? If a school system is keeping out a bunch of people, a bunch of kids, that's not really a strong education system. So what GPE is all about is helping governments improve their education systems and how those education systems deliver. And we are the only organization of our kind that exclusively focuses on that challenge, and we are also a significant funder of basic education. We're not the biggest funder of education globally. That's probably the governments themselves, and it should be. But we are a significant funder of basic education, and one of the reasons why we've chosen to target our funding to basic education, think about the staircase, is it helps create the stairs at the bottom of the staircase to try to get everybody started into education. So what we have learned, before I get to a little bit of the nitty-gritty of how we do it, about this concept of systems in education, some of the big picture learnings that we've had is that government ownership of it is vital. It is no good for a bunch of international organizations to come in and say, oh, we're going to do this, 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 and this, and then we're going to leave. The government has to take responsibility for it. They've got the regulatory authority, they've got the moral authority, they've got the revenue and taxation authority, which is often needs to be shored up, but they have that authority to provide, and they've got the responsibility to provide education for their citizens. So part of our ethos, in fact, it's probably our strongest part of our ethos, is the governments must be in the driver's seat. And there can be a lot of people alongside in the passenger seat and in the back seats helping, but the governments have to be in the driver's seat. And there are examples where we've seen globally where governments have taken leadership and responsibility for their education as part of their societal transformation, and over generations it has made all the difference in the world. And the two examples that people point to, I'm sure you all are studying this, is Finland and South Korea. So Finland, after World War II, decided that it had to recover from all of the ravages of World War II and built a very strong education system. They formulated specific relationships between the governments and the unions and the communities and the families. And I think they're not totally happy with their results at the moment, but they're still pretty much at the top of the pile. They're very close to the top of the pile. And they have an excellent education system. South Korea made the same decision after the Korean War, and decade in, decade out has put a lot of focus on education, and they too have an excellent education system. I think there are some questions that are being debated at the moment about, is it really what they want? I'm looking at you, you can educate us on this, but I still think that the South Korean education system would be at the envy of many. So that shows you why having governments in the driver's seat really matters. The other thing that we really realize in our work in understanding and trying to sort of conceive of the problem and the solutions is that there are no quick fixes here. This is not something that is going to be solved overnight. These systemic challenges are about how do you change how budgets get set? How do you change how people get trained? How do you change attitudes? How do you make sure that the government that's in the capital part of a city really reaches out and provides educational services to the hinterlands of a country. One of the particular challenges, particularly in big countries like Nigeria and Pakistan, for example, is where you have an enormous country with a federal state government structure below the federal government. There's all these really complicated questions about how does the federal government devolve responsibility down to the state level effectively. So these are not problems that get solved overnight, but what GPE has, the road that it has set itself out as a partnership is we must work behind government. So let me turn us to the slides for a second, and I just want to give you a little bit of a flavor for how we do our work. There's huge amounts of information on our website, so I'm not going to go into every little detail, and I'd be happy to answer whatever questions people have at the end. So let me just do a little bit of slides. So this is our vision and our mission to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. That is basically SDG 4. So we have put ourselves with our current strategic plan firmly in the SDG 4 camp. Our mission is to mobilize global and national efforts, meaning efforts that occur at the global level, I'll talk about that more in a minute, and at the country level to improve education, quality education, learning for all, working through all of the partners. I can get into a bit more detail there. The thing that is on this page that really is always in my mind is for the most vulnerable children. It's for the children who are most likely to never, ever, ever get close to a school. If we can help those children, we know we will have done a good job. So it's for the most vulnerable children. Often it's girls. Children with disabilities. How many of you have done any reading about the plight faced by children with disabilities in low-income countries? Has anybody have a sense of that? A little bit of a sense of that? Okay, let me just digress on that just a little bit. So one challenge is that governments in many of these countries don't even have really good data to know how many children there are with disabilities. And it could be everything from physical disabilities to intellectual disabilities, learning differences. Another interesting thing, how many of you all, and I'm not asking nosy questions, but how many of you all wear glasses or contact lenses? Okay. If I didn't have glasses and contact lenses, I would not even know that there's a room full of people here, so I'm going to put 2 hands up for me. For many of you, if you were living in some of the lowest income countries, you would be considered uneducatable because people would thought you would have a disability, that you were dumb because you couldn't see the blackboard. So, children with disabilities face enormous issues in these countries. So when we think about reaching the most vulnerable, it's for a whole range of types of issues. Now, on the question of disabilities, there are some countries that are making some real progress here, so it is not a stark picture, and I've seen some of it. I've seen a fantastic special needs school in Addis Ababa. I was on a trip to Benin in the beginning of December. I didn't see this school, but I was told, because some of my colleagues went to see it, I had to go see the government, that there was a fantastic school in Porto Novo for kids with disabilities, and we're doing a fantastic job teaching. They had mainstreamed the kids who were deaf into the mainstream classroom, and you couldn't tell who was deaf and who was not deaf, and they were doing a fantastic job. I've seen a school in the outskirts of Kathmandu where there was, I can't think of the name of the region in Kathmandu, but I can look it up and get it to you. But there was a man who was the principal of the school who had set up a classroom with teachers who had various disabilities, teaching the kids with the same disabilities to read. And it was incredible. So there are some bright lights here, but those are, I would say, are exceptions, not the norm. So that's what we're all about, is governments. We're about quality, we are about equity, reaching the most vulnerable, and we are a pretty substantial source of money that can help with all of this. So that's sort of what we're about. We are also enormous in our breadth. We work with 65 developing country partners. It's now, I think, 67. We have over 20 donor countries. We have civil society organizations globally. We work we are a formal partnership, so all of these types of organizations here are actually part of our governance and part of our partnership. So civil society organizations, international organizations, we have 3 UN agencies on our board, UNESCO, UNHCR and UNICEF. The private sector and private philanthropies are on our board. It's a little bit nascent, it's coming along, we need to do some more there. And of course, globally, the teachers associations, Education International is part of our board. So all of these organizations, and you can see the colors that represent where the countries are, 2/3 of it, of course, as you can imagine, is sub-Saharan Africa. All of these organizations are actually represented on our board. So our board has 19 different seats. Each one of them has a seat and an alternate seat, it's called. It's basically divided up in a third, a third, a third. The 67 countries hold 6 seats, and they're divided by region. The 20 donor countries hold 6 seats, and then the remaining 7 seats are divided amongst these others at the bottom. And one of the things that it is truly fascinating, sometimes if you feel like, sometimes it's like, ugh, but it is truly fascinating, is to see the totality of that group debate the issues of the day on education. So for example, one of the things that was heavily debated when we put our new strategic plan in place is should GPE be prepared to fund early childhood education? Because we had, prior to this current strategic plan, been only starting with primary school, not pre-primary school. And we made an argument, did a lot of consultation and so forth, around the notion, and I'm sure you all are familiar with this research because I think it's famous research now, that investments in early childhood education have significant payoffs relative to quality outcomes later. It's a way of establishing and promoting the readiness of kids to learn at an early age. So we added 1 year of basic education, of pre-primary education. But that debate was fascinating because people were like, well, is it more important, whoops, is it more important than this? Is it less important than this? What about this? So this board is it is the largest and singular thing of its kind, and it is in some ways the place where people look to see where is the direction going on education policy and delivery and financing issues in the development world. And it's because it is so big. I talked a little bit about our strategic plan. We have these 3 goals. Improved and more equitable learning outcomes. Number 2 is about equity. So this is really focusing on gender, inclusion, some of the disability issues. That's sort of a big umbrella concept. And the 3rd one is the efficiency of education systems. This is in some ways slightly supportive of the other 2. So that's another sort of wonky term. What is the efficiency of an education system? What does that mean exactly? So if you think about, again, education being sort of a process from pre-primary school up to university, and you think about classes of kids sort of going up, 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 up. If an education system has a lot of kids that are dropping out or repeating, or a teacher to pupil ratio that is sort of very satisfactory in one part of the country, like 1 to 20, and 1 to 400 in another part of the country. There's lots of indicators that you can look at to determine if an education system is working well. Does it have enough money? Are investments made consistently? Is it overseen well? One of the elements of strong education systems is, does it have a good system for managing data? And often we find that governments are terribly challenged by data. So one of the things that we're working on right now, I think there'll be a big paper produced sometime in March or so, is it's called our Data Roundtable, and it is an effort to study this whole question of data. And it will come out with some recommendations that we can share with our country partners about how they can begin to contend with this data challenge. We're working with Microsoft and Intel and a few others. I've had some remarkable meetings with the man who is the global head of all education everywhere from Microsoft. Okay, it took me about 30 seconds to really not understand what he was talking about because it got very, very technical. But this guy is really impressive, and Microsoft is now working with us on this data roundtable. So we're very excited about that. So those are our 3 goals: better learning outcomes, more equitable approach, make education available to everybody, and improve how these systems operate. Now, we have, if you go a little bit more granular, we have some objectives that sort of dig into, okay, so how do you do all of that? And I understand from Alex that you all have studied theories of change, and that you studied our theory of change. You have to tell me what grade you gave us, if it's going to work. But when we did our strategic plan last time, we asked ourselves very seriously, so, okay, that sounds nice, equity, better learning outcomes, better education systems. How do you actually do it? How does it get done? If you open the car or the hood, what does it mean? So our objectives, which are the sort of headlines of our theory of change, are the following. And we've divided them into 3 country-level objectives, because we work very closely in countries with governments, and 3 international level objectives. And when I say international level, that tends to be advocacy at the UN, it tends to be working with civil society organizations around sort of major fundraising efforts. It is certainly all the discussions with all the donors. It's the G7, the G20. In fact, this is really exciting. I'm sort of still pinching myself. I have now been invited by President Macron to join the Gender Advisory Council that is part of the deliberations of the G7 at their G7, the French G7 coming up. And we're delighted about that because the G7 typically does not really take up development issues. It tends to be more of a G20 thing. But because of President Macron and Prime Minister Trudeau before him, education, and particularly gender issues, girls' education, is rising to the surface in terms of the international agenda. So that is an example of how pushing and pushing and pushing is getting attention at the international level. So we're thrilled by that. But at the country level, this is what we do. These are our 3 objectives, and we are just laser focused on these. It's strengthening education sector planning and policy implementation. So what does that mean? Every 5 to 7 years or so, a country will set in place, and it often happens if there's a new government, a new education sector plan. That is a strategy for its entire education system for the next X years. And it's a moment for the country to take stock of how is it all going, how is the money being spent, where are the gaps, where are the issues, what needs to be fixed. And it's a moment to help a government sort of get on track with what its priorities are. And there's a lot of very sort of nitty-gritty work that goes on, and there's a lot of specialist organizations that help with that. So one of them, for example, is IEDP, which is one of the institutes of UNESCO. Dan is very close to them, Dan Wagner. And our role as GPE is to bring everybody together to make those education sector policy dialogues rich and strong, and to include everybody, because one of the things I should have said this earlier, one of the things that's very evident about education is it's sort of an it takes a village type of challenge. You need to have the teachers and the communities and the parents and the chiefs, if there's a traditional authority structure, and the government, You need to have everybody together agreeing on what's important. So that is a moment for, first of all, doing all the technical and policy work, but also galvanizing attention to it. So I was in Sierra Leone last week, and the new president there, President Bio, who was won election around last April, has just put in place a new plan called Free Quality Schooling for everyone. It's called FQSE, and I was there to help him launch a GPE grant to pay for part of that program. So that was part of the education sector plan, and it was a galvanizing moment for him to broadcast to everybody, we care about education. So the education sector planning moment is a big moment for a variety of reasons. Our second country level goal is to support what we call mutual accountability. And this is, remember I talked about how big the GPE board is with the teachers unions and the governments and the civil society organizations. What's interesting about GPE is all of those organizations don't just sit in rooms and meet in like Brussels and London and so forth. All of them, this is really interesting, all of them have a presence in some way, shape, or form in the countries. And so they get together with the government, and periodically, it's called a joint sector review process with the government. This doesn't happen perfectly, it's something I think we've got to strengthen. But the idea is that they get together with the government and say, okay, how's it going? And where's it not going so well? And how are we going to all hold ourselves mutually accountable for better outcomes? And because education is such a vast and complicated challenge, you have to plug into the local environment to be able to create this notion of mutual accountability. And then the third one is about, it's about, when we say GPE support, that is GPE's grant-making activities. So we are a significant provider of funds to the governments to help them pay for what is missing out of their own funds. So just to give you a sense of that, we distribute in grants. We're a grant maker, so we don't expect the money to be repaid. We distribute in grants about $500 million a year. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. We are on an upward trajectory to have that money go up. So the way that we raise that money is every 2 or 3 years, it's about 3 years, we go on a big, it's called replenishment, but it's a big fundraising campaign where we go and knock on the doors of all those 21 donors and say, I always have to make 3 arguments. Why should you care about international things? Why should you care about education? And why should you trust and have confidence in giving money to GPE? So we spend a lot of time, in addition to working on education sector plans and policy and monitoring issues, really structuring how we give money. And one of the things we've done over the last couple of years is restructure the concept of how we give money to make it performance-based. And I understand that you've written a paper for us on this, or on results-based financing, so I'm going to call you to help us get it right. But it's a tricky issue because there's a temptation in education to say, or there could be a temptation to say, well, if you can just hit these scores on national tests, all is good and we'll give you lots more money. It's not the way to think about it. It's too simple. So we spend a lot of time thinking about how impactful is the money that we're giving and what incentives do we create with the money. And we did a big restructuring of all of that in May 2014. And we're about to start our next strategic planning process, and I've asked my team, I've given them a bunch of questions saying, we need to get it to the next level in terms of sharpening our edge on this point. So it's a lot of time on effective use of money. We also have 2 what we call global level objectives. I referenced these earlier. Mobilize more and better financing. It is true globally, almost no matter what country you're talking about, education is not financed enough. There are always financial gaps. I believe there's all kinds of estimates. I'm sure you all know about them, and they sort of differ according to, are you talking about primary school or lower secondary school or this country or that country, but the numbers are in the trillions. And if you look at it globally, in the billions, depending on what zone you're looking at. So one of our big jobs globally is to mobilize more money. And we do it not only for the money that is under our command, which is in the GPE fund, we do it by doing sort of matching arrangements with other organizations. We say, first we have sort of a plain vanilla fund, but then we also say, well, if a country will put in $1 of their money, we'll go get $3 of other money. Did I get that right? Yeah, I got that right. So that's sort of a leveraging, that's called the multiplier fund. Well, the way that it works is the GPE will put in $1 more of its money if a country can identify $3 of somebody else's money. So from another development bank, for example. So we spend a lot of time on financing. Another interesting aspect of the financing equation is if you look at actually how all the sums come together on financing, it is the government's own resources that pay the large majority of education costs, and that's the way it should be. But what gives us concern is if we see a government pulling money out of education because they think that the international money is going to replace it. That's not a good place to be going, because the international money is actually quite volatile, and it's only sort of a year at a time. And so we actually say to countries, one of the requirements of getting GPE money is that you have to make a commitment to keep your money in at a 20% level. And then we'll put our money in, because we don't want our money displacing their money. So we spend a lot of time around this concept of financing. And then build a stronger partnership, and that's not just rhetoric. It is this whole notion of bringing all of these partners together, everyone with a clear role, really emphasizing that all of them have a role to play in reinforcing this notion of mutual accountability, and not duplicating the roles of each other. One of the tendencies that you see in the development world is a lot of organizations tripping over each other. We try to really clarify that by thinking about the effectiveness of the partnership as a whole. So those are our objectives that, as a group of 5 things, enable us to make progress on better equity, better quality, and better systems. How do we measure results? So we put together a results framework that has lots and lots of different types of metrics to measure the efficiency, or let's say the effectiveness of education systems. So we've taken our theory of change and we've said, okay, we can measure this one, we can measure this one. Some of them ought to be disaggregated between girls and boys. We do that in some cases. So we measure it, and it's arduous. We've established sort of measurement standards for all of them. One of the big challenges that we see is that many countries don't have the data. So one of the things we measure is the data available. But we measure it. And one of the documents that you may have seen on our website is we produce all this in a results report. It's a long, hard slog to read. I like to tease our previous chief technical officer, because she said, well, the short version is 200 pages. I'm like, okay. The long version is not even printable.
We only require the executive summary.
Even better. Okay. Well, we're trying to skinny down the reading, but haven't succeeded yet on that one. But we do measure it, and we are quite, one of the things, and the measurement is not perfect, but what we've tried to measure is the overall education system getting stronger? And an interesting thing that's happened lately, we were sort of walking a little bit on eggshells on this, is, so what would we do with the numbers? We do publish it in aggregate, and it would be, you could see that there would be sort of an automatic next question to be like, well, are we going to publish it by country? And we initially decided not to, because we didn't want to be seen to be in sort of a name and shame type of mode, because some countries may not have been comfortable with where they were on some of these statistics. And what's interesting is we've now been asked by some countries to start publishing the numbers. So I was in Sierra Leone, where I was, of course, last week, which is, my gosh, they've been through decades of civil war, followed by Ebola. Their education minister said, yes, I want to see my numbers. So there's a bravery associated with that, because they aren't going to be such good numbers. So what's interesting about this is that people want to see measurements. They're beginning to want to see measurements. Our board certainly wants to see measurements. And we are trying to take what is a very big, complicated topic and subject it to measurement. So that's what all this is about. It's if you really like, if you're really into metrics and measurement and M&E and the data and sort of that whole aspect of this, it's worth a read. It's interesting stuff. So where are we? If you read the report, you see, and there's 67, it talks on, about all of our work kind of across some of our, many countries are reporting, many aren't. I mean, you have to read sort of what's actually in there. But if one was to generalize, we are seeing progress on enrollment and completion rates, particularly at the primary level. I think that is in many ways a function of the focus on primary school education and enrollment coming out of MDG 2. So I'm sure that all of you know that if you look at the number of children who were out of school in 2000 versus the number at the primary level versus the number that are out of school now, there's been some pretty substantial progress on that. So that is in part what's driving this improvement on completion rates at the primary level. And maybe what I ought to do before I get into some of the details here, let me tell you, when I think about how we measure results, I think about 4 different concepts, and then the numbers get all sort of nitty-gritty, but 4 different concepts. One is there enrollment and completion at all different levels of school? Are children starting school and completing school, and starting school and completing school? That's one way of measuring success. Another is who is being excluded from the staircase. And if there are particular ethnic minorities or girls or children with disabilities who are chronically excluded, something is not right. So we look at the makeup of who is not in school to the extent that we have the data. A third conceptual area that we think about is financing. So is the government putting its own money into education? Is the international community putting enough money into education? And is it being supported well enough? We also, depending on circumstances, look at the cost per kid of education. You don't want to singularly focus on that because it might lead you to sort of think that if you just keep lowering the price per kid, it's good. That's not necessarily the right conclusion to draw. But we spend a lot of time looking at the sort of willingness to put money into education. And then the fourth major thing we look at are investments being made to improve quality. And this is principally around hiring more teachers, but it's really around training teachers. One of the investments that you can make to really improve quality is teacher training colleges in faraway places in countries to try to encourage the local community to get trained as a teacher and then stay in that community. So I was in a region called Louga in Dakar, and near Dakar in Senegal. It's actually about 3 hours outside of Dakar, over the summer in July, and I went to visit a teacher training college that we had financed, and they graduate 400 or so teacher students a year to stay in that region, which is a region that is sort of under-resourced in terms of teachers. So those are the 4 areas. Enrollment completion is one, exclusion is another, financing is a third, and quality is a fourth. So where are we? We are seeing decent progress in the enrollment and completion rate at the primary level, not at lower secondary and above. That's a break point. We are seeing more and more countries putting money of their own money into education and keeping it there. And we've got numbers on that. It's something we have to constantly sort of keep up on. I find myself from time to time having to have difficult conversations with finance ministers about, don't think our board's going to like those numbers. And our board is getting increasingly grumpy when they see that governments are withdrawing money that they shouldn't be doing from education. And then this whole concept of strong education sector planning is getting better. It's not perfect yet. I mean, one of the things that I think we're going to find in our latest upcoming round of evaluations is that these education sector plans are very ambitious they are somewhat disconnected from how much money is available. So they may need to be stronger around prioritization. Where are the challenges? Gender parity, particularly above primary school, is still a problem, and I'm sure you all know that from the work that you've done. And that is, so we see big drop-offs between primary school and secondary school. There are still not enough trained teachers, and one of the sort of mental images that I have in my head is that in many countries you've got population growth going like this and trained teacher availability flat to going down. Somehow we have to close that gap. One of the interesting, are you all familiar with the Education Commission that Gordon Brown and others have set up a few years ago? I believe out of, you've got reading.
They have one reading this week.
Okay, so one thing that is kind of coming out of that is worth keeping an eye on is there's a task force. It's called like workforce, teacher workforce, or so I don't have the right name. You'll have to get the right name for it. But what it is, it's fascinating actually. So if you think about the medical world, the world accepts that there is doctor, nurse, nurse's assistant, junior nurse's assistant, and that you've taken, there's sort of a nuancing around how staff and labor is used that is scarce within the medical community to sort of get kind of the highest talent on the hardest problems and then sort of, I guess, gradate from there. This task force is looking at whether or not there is an analogous concept for teaching. And so what it may mean is that in some classrooms there may be a teacher and a TA, which, in this environment is sort of commonplace. And so it'll be very interesting to see what those recommendations look like and whether or not they're able to make a dent on this problem. There's a woman who I met last week, because she's in Senegal, in Sierra Leone, who's on it, who I just thought was fascinating. Her name is Stanleya Beckley, and she is running the Teaching Service Commission in Sierra Leone, which is looking at this same issue in Sierra Leone, because they've got terrible challenges there with enough trained teachers. So this is a big problem, is the trained teacher problem. One of the, and this is a debate, one of the slippery slope aspects of this debate is some people may think, well, the answer is just give everyone a computer. You don't need to have a lot of teachers at that point. That's simplistic thinking. So this is as you all continue your work in education, this question of adequacy of teachers has got to be solved if we are going to make progress on some of these big picture goals. Data management, we talked about that, a lot of work to be done there. Alignment and harmonization, these are big complicated words for the concept of there are still a lot of donors going to countries. I hope we're not one of them, but maybe we're guilty of this too. We don't really consider ourselves a donor. We consider ourselves a partnership of lots of people. But there are a lot of organizations, not just donors, who go and say, well, I want you to go do my little project over here, and I want you to go do my little project over here. And governments wind up chasing the priorities of all the visitors as opposed to saying, no, our plan is this. And so we measure that, and I do think that there is progress to be made in thinking about that, because if we get that, if we make improvements there, money will be used more wisely, and governments will not just be chasing the priorities of all the visitors. So those are areas that we really need to continue to work on as we go into our next chapter. This just gives you, I told you about that we have this big country, that there's a lot of work that goes on in the countries. This just gives you a little bit of a detail on what that looks like. The Ministry of Education, we work through two major sort of entities there. The Ministry of Education is what I would call the client. We work through what's called a coordinating agency, which coordinates the policy dialogue with the government, bringing into consideration the teachers groups, the private sector, the civil society. That's sort of, they're the gatherer of all the opinions and all the information. The coordinating agency is usually UNICEF or one of the donors, DFID, or I believe UNESCO is a coordinating agency. There's a lot of them. The grant agent is sort of who holds our money and helps disperse the money to the government according to what the program in particular is. And all of them work together to support the Ministry of Education. So we have a very kind of carefully constructed set of activities in the country that tries to sort of bring to life this concept of put the ministry in the driver's seat and bring all of the sort of assets, technical knowledge, money, political to them. That's sort of what it looks like in detail. Interesting stuff. And what's really interesting is, how often do you think all these people agree with each other? Correct. So it's often pretty interesting debates, actually. So let me just give you a few examples of sort of the role that we play in countries. We are a convener. We leverage the strength of partners. We provide, we like to all act together and try to incentivize change. A fascinating example that we've spent a lot of time on over the past, it just explains what all that means. Over the past 18 months or so is between Bangladesh, Cox's Bazar, where the Rohingya refugees are, and Myanmar. So how many of you are aware of the Rohingya refugee crisis? Okay, good. So the Rohingya refugees fled Myanmar, and they are in a sort of a zone between Bangladesh and Myanmar called Cox's Bazar. And they are not getting access to education, as often refugees do not get access to education. At the heart of that issue is the following challenge, which is that the Bangladeshi government does not want the Rohingya refugees to stay in Bangladesh forever, and the Myanmar government doesn't necessarily want them going back to Myanmar. And that is a huge oversimplification of a very challenging problem. So what happens to the education of the children of the Rohingya refugees? Do they just do nothing, or what happens? And that challenge gets sort of translated into education terms in the following ways, which is, well, if somebody starts providing education to the Rohingya refugees, what language is it going to be? If it's in Bangla, it's sort of an incentive for them to stay in Bangladesh. If it's in the language in Myanmar, which they don't want either, they'll go back to Myanmar. So what language do you teach them in? And do you teach them in a way that's sort of permanent or transitory? And do you give them certification, sort of reports and grades and stuff that is sort of recognized by Bangladesh or by Myanmar? So the geopolitical situation quickly translates itself into very tricky issues for what does education look like. So we have worked with all the partners there to come up with a game plan, which is to provide transitory education that sort of has sort of a stair-step approach to what it looks like in a third language. That is a great sort of negotiated outcome. And we also had we had given a grant to Bangladesh of $100 million. There was $8 million left. We went to them and said, we didn't have a grant initially for Cox's Bazar because it's not a country. We went to Bangladesh and said, would you be prepared to let $8 million go to the Cox's Bazar to the refugees? It took a lot of negotiation with the Prime Minister there. I had to go to the Bangladesh Embassy in Washington at least once or twice. Our board chair talked to the Prime Minister. There was a lot of outreach on that one. And at the end of the day, the Bangladeshi government agreed that we could give the $8 million to the refugees and a little bit of it to what's called the host communities on the edge of Cox's Bazar, so that they didn't see that money was going to the refugees but not to themselves. So we have given money to the Rohingya refugees. Well, it's not an enormous amount of money, but it's something. And then in Myanmar, we had remained quite concerned that the policy of the Burmese government was to exclude ethnic minorities from education. So if you think about our big goals, equity, don't leave people out, the idea that you can just say, okay, well, we don't want to give money to this ethnic minority or this ethnic minority, didn't work. So Myanmar applied to be part of the partnership, and in order to become part of the partnership, one of the qualifications is that they have to have what's called a strong education sector plan, which means, and part of what equals strong is that it's available to everybody, because one of our goals is equity. So I get lots of letters on my desk to sign. And I got the one to the Minister of Education from Myanmar saying, "Dear Minister, congratulations, you've been approved to be part of the partnership of GP." And I read it and I said, okay, really? No. I said, I want much stronger language in here about their commitment to not exclude the ethnic minorities when they do their plans. And we left that language in there, and it stayed in there. So we have used the education sector planning concept to advance the concept of equity. So that's a really interesting example. It's early days to see what happens there, complicated, but it's a very interesting example. Here's a few others. We continue to invest in quality in various ways. We provide in-service training in the DR Congo. We have standardized tools for class observation. These are just sort of little examples of some of the things that we've done. A teacher training directorate in Cambodia, in-service teacher training. We've also, again, helped on upgrading qualifications in training colleges. These are all examples of sort of line items within grants that we provide to the governments to help them strengthen those parts of the overall education sector plan that are weak. So it differs kind of country to country. These are the examples from the DRC and Cambodia. You can't see very well, can you? Okay.
The second screen.
I'm getting towards the end. I won't talk about this one. I'll talk about it in a minute. So a magic moment. So I talked about the fact that we do our replenishments every 3 years. So our last one was just about a year ago, the big event around it. Typically it's kicked off by a big event. And the last one was just about a year ago in Dakar in 2018. And you know, GPE has been on this trajectory of, it started out, you know, being just a little tiny sort of team inside, very heavily embedded in the World Bank. And due to the board and, you know, lots of people working hard, it has put itself on a trajectory of becoming a big, strong organization with all of the right parts and the sort of flagship organization in education. And what we did for this replenishment was I was offered the opportunity by the Minister of Education in Senegal. He's very good friends of ours, and he said, well, we'll help you in your next replenishment if you'd like. And I said, okay, let me think about that. And then I said, okay, that's a really interesting idea. We could do it in Senegal, but we need a G7 partner. And so I started thinking about that, and it was in April or so 2017, and President Macron had not yet won the first round of the French elections. So I said, all right, well, let's go see their campaign people in case they win. And we went to some garage in, like, you know, the outskirts of Paris, and I saw their chief diplomatic advisor guy, and I said, look, let me tell you about us. We're this cool thing. You need to care about education. It's very important. If you win, we'd like to work with you. And he said, okay, I'll remember that. So they won the first round, and I called him up and I said, don't forget about us. If you win, we'd like to see you. So they won. So I called him in the Élysée Palace, like the next week after they had won, you know, their White House. And I said, don't forget about us. And he said, well, come see us. So I went to Paris, and I said, so would you be interested in, I went to see Mrs. Macron and Brigitte, and I said, so would you be interested in co-hosting our replenishment between you and President Macky Sall, who's the president of Senegal? Was that something you would conceive of? Because of course France and Senegal have a close relationship, and they came back very quickly and they said yes. And it was the first time, and so getting political leadership at a G7 level is a home run for an organization like ours. So it was the first time that a G7 government has ever decided to recognize education and GPE. And then I went back to Senegal and I said, so, I went to go see President Macky Sall, and I said, so, thank you for your offer to help us with our replenishment. Would you be interested in having it done here in Dakar, co-hosted by President Macron? And he said, sure. So, this is what it wound up being. We had 10 heads of state. About 8 of them were from the continent. We had President Macri on the video. President Macron came. We had hundreds of ministers there, education ministers, finance ministers. We invited Rihanna to be our global ambassador. She is still our global ambassador. Our board chair, of course, is Julia Gillard. So you have Julia Gillard, who's the former Prime Minister of Australia, and before that she was the Education Minister of Australia. President Macky Sall, Rihanna, President Macron. We raised about double the money that we did last time. Double, not quite double, but we're getting there. And it was this incredible magic moment. So we have begun to make progress on elevating education to the global agenda, and it's moments like these that were sort of magic moments. So in thinking about the future, I mean, one thing that's very clear is that this is a long game problem, and if we expect to get this solved like tomorrow, forget it. I mean, you've got to be in this for generations. There's, I think, one thing that will emerge in the agenda is that I think there's a lot of room for improvement if the different sectors in the development world work together. Health and education is the obvious one, but there's also nutrition. So how many of you are familiar with the World Bank's Human Capital Index, which is their new thing that they've just, okay, good. There's a sort of a triangle kind of embedded in that, which is that governments need to invest in better nutrition, better education, and better health in order for people to develop for countries to develop the human capital that they need to promote growth. Something that we will start thinking about more is what role does GPE play in working together with the obvious sectors where there's connectivity. We will always worry about funding, and in the world where politics are topsy-turvy, not all governments are enamored all the time with the idea of providing international assistance. How do you think about a financing model to support all of this when the financing environment is quite topsy-turvy? That's an interesting question. We will start thinking about that. And we have to think long-term about sustainability, not in the sense of, in the environmental sense of the word, but what financing model does it take to enable these countries to provide education, attract more teachers, pay people properly, invest in the things that drive quality over the long term. And there is clearly not enough money. So what changes need to be made to overcome that problem? And there's always things to worry about in terms of making this all more efficient. Are there too many organizations? Do they not coordinate well? Can you reduce and streamline the whole process to make it lighter? How do you make sure you're not like over-evaluating everything and underdoing? I mean, there's always questions about making sure that it operates better. So let me stop there. I'll leave you with the picture of Rihanna and President Macky Sall and President Macron, who I'll be seeing the week after next at the Elysee, I think, and Julia, who I will also be seeing right afterwards. Anyway, thank you.
come from the discussion board that we had in advance of your coming. So I'm just going to call on the folks and I can tell that we're going to run a little late. So the questions aren't long, but I'll just ask you to keep your answers brief.
Okay.
The questions are also complex.
Sure.
But anyway, you're good at that, better than I am, that's for sure. Anu, you have a question about the systems thinking you wanted to?
Yeah, so the readings that we got, in that I read that the GPE takes a systems approach to solving some of its problems. So in that, I was wondering, we did a reading about some of the wicked problems in international development, and I was wondering what some of the biggest wicked problems that GPE, you have actually answered some of that, are for the GPE, and if there is room to fail in GPE, generally, as you know.
If there's room to fail, I mean, we don't look to fail, but there, you know, we ought to be humble and smart enough to realize that we better be pretty open-minded about continuous improvement.
Right.
So what would be an example of that? There's lots of examples of that. I didn't go into too much detail on it, but we restructured our funding model in May 2014 to be more performance-based. I'm not sure we've quite gotten it right, so I think we need to change it. And I've asked my team to start brainstorming about that. There's, you know, there ought to be, we ought to have a willingness to experiment in education, actually. And that's not easy all the time. So those are just a couple of, you want me to be quick answers, but there is, there needs to be an experimentation, there needs to be an attitude about trying things out, an attitude towards if it doesn't work, change it. One of the things that's, I think one of the big, you talked about what are the biggest systemic challenges. I think one of the biggest systemic challenges is how do you define and measure the quality of education in a way that can be scaled to an extent, but also understands that countries have different choices and they're sovereign entities. They've got different choices about how they want to teach people. And I think there's an enormous amount of work to do around this question of quality. And you know, you do see some common themes like 21st century skills and things like that, but there's a lot of work on this one to be done.
You had a question about results-based financing.
Yeah. You mentioned your partnership with the government of Sierra Leone, and I read that you have an interest in funded system that is based on the 70% that you already give to the government and the 30% that is related to certain outcomes. So my question was, could you speak more to this experience, whether you had it in the past with other governments and how effective was it? And also whether there are other like alternative financing systems for education that use GPE.
I mean, I haven't done sort of a whole survey on every results-based financing thing, but I think that ours is unusual. I'm not sure it's unique, but it's unusual. And what the basic logic behind it is that the 70% ought to incent sort of strengthening the system, sort of in its sort of basic sense, a good education plan, financing commitments, and data, so it incents the sort of efficiency of the system. And then the 30%, which is only paid after goals are reached, is the incentive to improve how the system delivers. So you've seen the indicators in Sierra Leone. The way that it works is that a country has to identify what we call a stretch target in one of three areas and then meet it in order to get the money for the 30%. And the three areas are better efficiency, better quality, and better equity. And so those are our three goals. That's why we've sort of structured it that way. One question that we will look at is this 30% concept working, and should it be applied equally across 67 countries where you've got, at the very low end of the range, the role of our money might be better to just supplement the government's budget, because there is, like in Somalia, for example, where the budgets are so limited. And in a country like Kenya, for example, where GPE shouldn't be necessarily acting as a subsidizing organization to a government, putting much more of the emphasis on incenting change and improvement. So those are just ideas at the moment. They're not by any means policy changes yet, but I think that we need to be in a willingness to continue to refine and look at our model.
Liam, another question about investing and building relationships with global stakeholders.
Yeah, so you already sort of touched on the challenge that people who work in international education development face in getting the urgency of the work acknowledged. So I wanted to ask about your take on, yes, we have this urgency, but alongside that, there's no quick fix, and the building the structure, and understanding the context that underlie education structures, that takes time. And so you talk about balancing time and resources that it takes into understanding that context, building those relationships, and yes, resources and time that go into it.
Yes, I mean, I think that when we think about how do we invest money in the sort of galvanizing awareness world, it's around building coalitions locally that can continue to advocate towards their governments to continue to pay attention to education. So there's sort of a consistency required in terms of building those investments. We're about to launch a new window called the Advocacy and Social Accountability Window. It will be oriented towards, part of it towards local advocacy to sort of be a voice in relation to the government, to make sure that government's aware of children who are not getting, who are getting excluded from school. So that, but the way we think about that is, they're not going to have sort of, an effect from one day to another. What you're trying to sort of build is finance a voice locally. I'm not sure I've totally answered your question.
I think that's a good start.
Well, this new window is not, we're sort of in the 25th mile out of 26 in getting it approved, but it'll be something interesting to watch. And it's got, in fact, there'll be papers out about it, and it'll be one thing to look at is how do we measure success of it, and how do we try to connect the dots between a stronger local voice and what the education outcomes are, and particularly around the issues of exclusion. It's a very tricky topic.
I mean, you put a huge emphasis on the dialogue.
Yes.
And I know that it's always a hard thing to follow through. But it seems to me like, I'm speaking to your employees out in the field, they spend a lot of time in dialogue and seem very committed to it. So.
We are very intent. I mean, this notion of sort of having a local education group with everybody sort of involved is not just sort of kumbaya rhetoric. I mean, there's a reason for it, which is that you have to build a community will and incentive and galvanize a government to do something, and that has to happen locally. But it can't just happen if you go to a capital and sit in a hotel room once and then leave. I mean, you've got to build the relationships and encourage people. I was just with a bunch of civil society organizations in Freetown last week, and I spent a good hour with them hearing about their plans and encouraging them to stick with it. And I do that quite often. I think it's helpful. I think it's helpful.
Matthew, you had a question about the case.
Yes. I had a question about the knowledge management system you're working on, the Knowledge and Innovation Program.
Right.
I just wanted to know, with scaling that in partner countries, if there are common institutional capacity issues that you have to kind of handle. And related to that, I was also curious if there's been any pushback from DFID or the World Bank or other institutions that commission similar products.
Well, it hasn't launched yet. So again, this is another one that's in the 25th out of 26 miles in terms of getting approved. I think that the challenge locally, I mean, you're right about capacity, and we're going to have to get the balance right between making new and innovative ideas available, but not sort of having it become so frequent that it's just sort of the idea du jour. And when you see the design of it, one of the things that you'll see is that it's unlike others. It is designed to be very demand driven by the countries. So it's not going to be just visitors showing up saying, oh, why don't you do this, and oh, why don't you do that. So that will hopefully address the local prioritization and capacity problem. DFID is on our board. They're supportive of it. The World Bank is on our board. They're also supportive of it. I think that the notion of exchange that it has and being very demand-driven by the countries may distinguish it from some of the other knowledge work that the others do. So it's designed in particular not to duplicate what they do.
Great, thank you.
Yes, I hope that stays that way.
A question of disability, yeah.
Yeah, so you wrote survey on disability and it was included on the goal table. But it seems like there's no indicators stick directly towards the population with disability. So can you share a bit more in addition to measuring all of school kids with disabilities? Like how does that play out on the country level in education sector planning?
Well, so we're at a sort of a formative stage on this, and I was actually at the Disability Summit that was launched by the UK government last June, I believe it was, on this. There's the reason why it does not. It is in the concept of equity in our thinking. It is not yet in our results framework because the numbers are just simply not available. It would not surprise me if, as we do the next round or two of our results framework, we try to get data that allows us to disaggregate children with disabilities. But the numbers are just simply not available, which is the reason why it's not there right now. But it doesn't mean that it is not important. And as we work with governments on their education sector plans, it's something that we talk to them about, but we're not in a position yet to measure it.
Let me have a couple of faculty here. I'll give you dibs if you'd like to jump into the question before we go to the... Yeah, fantastic. Great. Let me get a sense of, because we have about 15 minutes or so, so let me get a sense of the room. How many people want to ask a question? That's actually pretty good. All right, so I think we'll try to go one at a time for now. Keep your questions focused and with a question mark at the end of the sentence, right? Make sure it's clear, make it clearly a question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm a PhD student studying educational measurement here. So you talked about the importance of learning in SDG 4. So my question is, what is GP doing to build the capacity of countries to assess how the students are learning within a country? Like, are you supporting PISA, or are you supporting governments to make up their own national assessments, or what are you doing?
So two things. One is that we do spend a lot of time on sort of the teacher training and teacher in-service teachers themselves. In terms of the assessment, as you know, it is a patchwork quilt if you were to look sort of globally at the different learning assessments that are available. We'd like to see that countries have a form of national assessment in place and that they use it. And sometimes our money does get used to strengthen that on occasion. I think that we would be, it wouldn't philosophically sit with us to say, okay, all of a sudden now everybody has to do PISA. Because some countries, first of all, PISA is expensive, and some countries may not want to be ranked in that fashion. So we try very hard not to have sort of a one-size-fits-all approach to this, but we do think the countries ought to have some form of assessment in place, and we look for that.
There was a hand in the back. Yeah.
Wait.
Yeah.
Okay. On a personal level, I'm just curious, in an organization so vast, when you walk into work each day, how do you decide what your priority is, or which country to focus on, or which political leader to network with? And then just plainly out of curiosity, how did you choose the celebrity spokesperson? Just like, it's quite quite a line. I was just curious what the
Here was taken.
Well, we on the celebrity side, you know, we work with a couple of other organizations who are sort of recommending relationships with this person and that person, and it sort of just came together. You know, we didn't run a contest or anything like that, and we consider ourselves quite fortunate to get to work with Rihanna. She's really quite something. And she has huge sort of global reach and Twitter followers and so forth. In terms of prioritization, there are sort of, I mean, first of all, I love walking into work every day. Every day I smile, and I consider myself remarkably fortunate to get to work there. In terms of the countries that I think about, you know, we have a pipeline of countries ahead of us in sort of our work, and I kind of check in on the pipeline regularly, and, you know, there'll be sort of the first chunk of what's going on, then the next chunk, then the next chunk. I spend a lot of time when I travel, and I travel a lot to the countries. I'm going to Burkina Faso and Chad in about a week, for example. I spend a lot of time studying what's going on there so that I'm usually there for 2 or 3 days per country, so I can try my very hardest to make an impact and leverage some change in the right direction. So that's some of my priorities. So I probably spend, you know, I probably spend a third of my time thinking about donor issues, a third of my time thinking about country issues, and a third of my time on internal issues. If I was to say, that's probably not every day, but that's sort of what the makeup ought to be. In terms of the donor issues, there's sort of a natural cycle to it. You know, if there's an election in a country, you want to sort of make sure you really understand what it means for their attitude towards aid. You know, another way to think about it is that we sort of operate in kind of 3-year cycles. So the year right before a replenishment, I spend most of my time seeing donors and asking for money. Then the year after replenishment and the year after that, I spend most of the time thinking about the countries and the spending of the money well. You know, we also and there's a strategic plan that we usually get fit in there. So there's just sort of these natural cycles that kind of drive it.
Let me ask a strategic and serious question following up about Rihanna, right? Because the final product for this class, the final deliverable, all the students are going to be working on a policy brief. And so we've spent some time thinking about how policy analysis is done, and started to spend some time thinking about how little of it actually gets listened to, or how hard it is. Someone last week said, I've heard only 1% of policy analysis ever gets read by policymakers, or something along those lines. How do you work to get the message of good analysis and good research readable and in the hands of policymakers, and sort of, in the RISE program, we're starting to think seriously about the role of sort of star power, and do we need a Rihanna of our own to get people to listen to the research, and how, because researchers are really bad at that, right? They're really, really bad at doing that. So.
That's a very good question. It's something that we spend a lot of time talking about as well. And the way that one thing that is not obvious is for an organization like ours, communications, the whole communications and advocacy function is absolutely essential. And the way that I've described it to my team is you've got to think about it like this, okay? We need to, on the one hand, be able to influence the sort of horizontal world of global policymakers, foreign ministers, youth, people who study Twitter, popular culture, and make them understand that this issue matters, because that will drive highest level political attention to the issue. And one of the best examples of how that was done successfully was, think about, this is maybe before you all were around, but the sort of cancel debt kind of efforts, Bob Geldof and all that, kind of in the, I guess it was the 90s. The AIDS lobby had a significant, Elton John, and had a significant impact on drawing the attention to AIDS, which then not only resulted in a lot of remediation efforts here, but it was sort of one of the things that gave rise to the Global Fund. So it is it is not sort of a fluff ball part of our work to get this high level attention to work, and you have to do it, but you can't, you've got to, that is, the form of communication with that world is very different from the technical world. And so the up and down part of the T is that in order for an organization like mine to be credible and earn its street cred in the technical world, it has to do excellent technical and policy work, excellent analytical work, and we have to be credible and earn our street cred in places like CIES and in all the sort of technical environments. And you have to be able to do both. And one of the things that we've now really accepted and sort of put into our work is that you have to be able to speak credibly to the audience that you're speaking to and understand that not every piece of communication can be the same for everybody. Because a lot of the deep technical work that you all may be familiar with, people in this world aren't going to read it. They're just not going to read it. Whereas the people in the sort of deep technical world is going to think that maybe some of fluffy. And so but you have to be able to do both, and we've really made great progress, I think, in understanding that. But the star power matters. The star power matters.
So tell us who you are.
Dominic Mundanga. I'm in the Education and Entrepreneurship program, and for the last 5 years I've been working for UNICEF. Before I ask my question, I just wanted to say thank you very much for the work that you do.
Well, thank you.
I manage programs that were funded by GPE in Zimbabwe.
All right.
Working with Ms. Ramos.
Okay, Lucinda.
Yeah. So thank you very much. I think sometimes it's easy to sit in the office and not see the real impact, but I used to manage out-of-school education programs for kids to get back into school, and the money that you guys provided was very, very, very useful.
Good.
We got a ton of kids back into school.
Great.
So that the work makes a very big difference. My question is on the issue of technology. How is the GP thinking about leveraging technology, particularly to expand access? I'm asking that because I have, in my work on the out-of-school children initiative, one of the 2 big reasons for out-of-school children dropping out has to do with distance travel to school.
Right.
And technology could bridge that gap in some way. But I heard you say that, of course, it's not a panacea for a problem. So what are you thinking in terms of access and technology?
I think there is a role for technology in resolving the problem. And I just have seen, the question is what's the role and what's the right role? In Sierra Leone last week, they had to close the schools for a year because of Ebola. And what they did was they used their radio broadcast system. It started out broadcasting information to the families about Ebola, and then they used it to broadcast school lessons. And the test scores that year in Sierra Leone were the highest. And they're now contemplating using the radio system to broadcast lessons out to the far parts of the country and keep it going. So that's an example of a technology that can be used to sort of address an access issue. You certainly know that there's a thing to get right in, if you think about technology as replacing the role of the teacher, that's not necessarily going to be the right way to go. If you think about technology as helping the teacher, that could be the right way to go, but then you can't make sort of heroic assumptions about electricity, downloading costs, internet costs, connectivity, particularly into the farther areas. So we have to get it right, and it's tricky, and it's not going to be sort of a one-size-fits-all solution. And I think that I actually think that we've got to involve the teachers in the conversation to sort of get their view on it.
So I'm going to take 2 questions in the interest of equity. Let me try and say people who are
currently in the class and who didn't get to go to lunch? Can we get it? And then if there's no one in that category, then we can open it up beyond that. But one, anyone else? Okay, and two, and then maybe we'll have to call it.
Thank you so much. So we read a report from the Learning Generation that talks a lot about how funding for emergency situations, like the human crisis, is critical, and that that need is growing, but that funding has actually decreased. So I guess, and especially because a lot of that work is not necessarily just on a country level context, we have movements of people in multiple countries and different governments that are stakeholders there. So if you could talk a little bit about the emergency funding structures that the Global Partnership has. We read the report that mentioned maybe developing some sort of multilateral, I think, bank financing structure for that, but I wasn't quite sure. So.
Before you answer, number one, you get your question on. All right, then that's it. We'll do the last question first.
Well, I'm always an email away for anybody who has any further questions. So I think this is we didn't really talk about this much, but one of the big realizations over the past 2 or 3 years, I'd say, is how much humanitarian and refugee and conflict situations are damage school. Whether or not children have to flee to a different country, or schools get destroyed by war, or it's really those two, or civil war. And if you look at the whole sort of UN construct, they tend not to define lack of education as a humanitarian crisis. It tends to be blankets and tents and water, and you can sort of understand that. But with the refugee and sort of humanitarian crises now, they're not over quickly. They tend to last years. I mean, I think the number is 17 to 20 years, and that's a whole kid's education life. So I think there's been a correct realization in the sort of international community that there's a gap here. And there's been some things done to begin to remedy the gap. There's been an organization that was created about 2 years ago called Education Can't Wait that works at the sort of humanitarian end of it. That's great, and we work with them very closely. If you look at how our money is actually spent, about 50% of it is on conflict and fragile situations. So for example, one of the things that we've done about 2 years ago was we gave some additional funding, or we structured a grant to Chad to help them provide schools to refugees coming over from Boko Haram. That's why I'm going to Chad in a week to see it. And of course, the problem is that if you have refugees coming from somebody else's country and you don't have enough money for your own citizens on your budget, what's the incentive to take some of that money and give it to the refugees? Tough choice. So first of all, we are spending time on this. We're also sort of working on this question of complex emergencies. Our board just approved a new approach for how we work in complex emergencies, which is defined as absence of government. So we're spending a lot of time on it. There's this other organization. We're sort of working with them very closely. The logic is that the international community would be able to respond quickly to an emergency and then help the country build back better and then restore education. And that's why we work closely with this other organization. From a fundraising perspective, it would make sense to sort of look more broadly at the development funding and the humanitarian funding and see how you could sort of strategize around approaching both of them with sort of a common proposition. So there is a lot of focus on it. There's a lot of, I can go on and on for a while. And it's a good thing because I think it's something that was a gap. And at the moment we see, at least this is true last year, I may have changed a little bit, but we're sort of at a high watermark of the number of conflict and refugee situations in the year around. It's principally Syria. It's principally Syria.
All right, well, we are going to whisk you off to Dr. Wagner's class. That was a terrific talk from an inspiring and effective leader of an important global institution, which is what this lecture series is supposed to be about. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Tim be the gatekeeper of your email, I guess it.
Tim is the gatekeeper of the email.
Awesome.
Yes. Well, thank you all very much for your interest, and keep interested. Keep interested. So what shall I do if, I'm going to give this back to you so I don't walk out with it. It doesn't wind up.